The narrator watched the open hit like a trap as red bled across every screen. Ethan Cole stared at the tickers and felt the floor tilt. Ethan Cole said, "The bridge is gone." Phone screamed and then went thin. Luis Ramirez slid a payroll sheet forward with steady hands. Luis Ramirez said, "We have 40 hours if vendors bend." The narrator traced a terse email that killed the credit line without a word. Ethan Cole said, "They pulled it at the bell." Nina Park studied ratios that fought their own math. Nina Park said, "Usage does not match output." The office hushed, as if walls listened for blame. A call window flashed like a lure. Victoria Hale said, "Talk before noon or the window closes." The narrator marked the time and felt the city lean. Ethan Cole said, "We move now, or we sink." The narrator held the breath of the room and counted loss like rain. The narrator traced a call that cut through pride and static. Victoria Hale spoke with a voice that sold calm like currency. Victoria Hale said, "I can steady this if you accept control." Ethan Cole watched rain beat along the glass and fall in lines. Ethan Cole said, "Define control." The list came like gears, precise and cold. Victoria Hale said, "Board seats, ratchets, information rights, weekly covenants." The room felt smaller by inches. The narrator marked the pause and weighed its cost. Ethan Cole said, "Send terms." A ping hit the inbox like a gavel. The narrator felt the air thin around the desk. Ethan Cole said, "We read, then we counter." The narrator saw risk and hope share a narrow chair while the clock began to sprint. The narrator followed Ethan Cole into a quiet club that smelled of wood and loss. Mark Ritter waited with a stare that knew where traps were laid. Mark Ritter said, "Terms like hers never come back to you." Ethan Cole stirred cold coffee until the swirl stalled. Ethan Cole said, "I am out of choices." The narrator watched a finger lift like a small warning. Mark Ritter said, "She trades in fear and time. Both are priced high." Lamps hummed with old music and soft amber. Ethan Cole said, "I need leverage, not mercy." The table held a heavy silence as the check slid in. The narrator wrote the hour and underlined it twice, because it felt like a hinge the night might turn on. The narrator returned to a war room where charts covered glass like frost. Nina Park pinned a line that bent the wrong way and waited. Nina Park said, "Output claims fight the meter draw." The hum of servers pressed at the ears. Ethan Cole said, "Show the join." She lined shipments to energy spikes with neat care. Nina Park said, "The curve breaks on peak weeks, and it breaks the same way." The room filled with clean fear, the kind that favors proof. Ethan Cole said, "Build a file with dates and links." Keys clicked fast, and folders bloomed with sharp names. The narrator felt the air charge like a storm that had not chosen a street. The case had a fuse, and someone had lit it. The narrator measured the afternoon by a silence between rings. Luis Ramirez stacked vendor notes like a shaky bridge that might hold once. Luis Ramirez said, "We can stretch 12 hours if we ask hard." Ethan Cole stared at a calendar crowded with red circles. Ethan Cole said, "Then the runway ends." The word closed like a door. Nina Park said, "Proof buys time if we press now." Footsteps crossed the corridor with care as if the floor might judge them. The narrator tasted metal in the air, thin and sharp. Ethan Cole said, "We move before the close tomorrow." The plan sat on the table like a live wire. The narrator kept the count and did not blink. The narrator watched numbers fight the truth like waves against a wall. Nina Park stacked graphs until a pattern showed. Nina Park said, "Shipments peak, but meters dip." Ethan Cole felt the room cool. Ethan Cole said, "Walk me through every join." The narrator saw columns line up like train cars. Nina Park said, "These weeks borrow output from thin air." A silence held. The narrator counted the clicks as she saved clean files. Ethan Cole said, Tag sources and timestamps. The printer hissed like a slow fuse. Nina Park said, "This can stand up in a room." The narrator wrote, "The quiet fear that comes with proof." Ethan Cole said, "Proof is our oxygen now." The hum of servers rose and then fell. The narrator held the line as if a storm pressed on the glass. The narrator followed a meeting link that opened like a gate. Victoria Hale smiled with a calm that sold control. Victoria Hale said, "Capital today, but I choose the driver." Ethan Cole kept his voice flat. Ethan Cole said, "Define the road and the guardrails." The narrator felt the air thin as terms appeared. Victoria Hale said, 2 board seats, anti-dilution, weekly cash sweeps." The clock beat faster. Ethan Cole said, "Price moves if risk is known." The narrator watched her pause as if hearing thunder. Victoria Hale said, "Bring facts, and price can bend." The room waited on a single file. Ethan Cole said, "Then you see the meter gap." The narrator marked the moment a deal learned a new shape. The narrator counted hours like coins. Luis Ramirez held a thin stack of options. Luis Ramirez said, "Vendors can wait 1 day, maybe 2 if we call." Ethan Cole stared at the runway chart and did not blink. Ethan Cole said, "Call now and log every promise." The narrator heard the careful tone he saved for cliffs. Luis Ramirez said, "Morale bends when checks slip." The printer fed new pages like tired breaths. Ethan Cole said, "We share the truth without panic." The narrator watched a team move with quiet hands. Luis Ramirez said, "If the funds fail, we need a bridge we own." The corridor hummed like a wire. The narrator wrote the weight of a payroll that could end a story. The narrator met Mark Ritter in a booth that kept its own secrets. Mark Ritter set a pen between them like a line. Mark Ritter said, "Her claws will own your mornings and your nights." Ethan Cole let the words sit. Ethan Cole said, "What would you trade to keep the wheel?" The room smelled of coffee and rain. Mark Ritter said, "You trade time, and then you trade voice." The narrator felt an old loss cross his face. Ethan Cole said, "Then I need leverage, or I walk." A server passed like a ghost. Mark Ritter said, "Leverage is proof backed by courage." The narrator wrote that down because it hurt and helped at once. The narrator followed an email thread that felt like a trap door. A forward showed term sheets sent days before the crash. Ethan Cole said, "How did she get our deck before the ask?" The cursor hovered. The narrator heard a slow breath on an open line. Nina Park said, "Headers point to someone inside our circle." The room cooled. Ethan Cole said, "No names until we verify." The narrator weighed the urge to shout against the need to think. Luis Ramirez said, "We lock access and rotate keys now." The clock was a drum. Ethan Cole said, "We finish the case, then we confront." The narrator wrote the word trust and saw it thin like paper in rain. The narrator watched Nina Park open a lender packet that looked harmless. Tabs hid clauses like hooks. Nina Park said, "There is a covenant that triggers default if we pause diligence." The room cooled. Ethan Cole said, "Show the trigger path." She mapped arrows across a clean page. The narrator read words that stacked into a trap. The clause tied grace periods to a secret metric. Nina Park said, "It resets if we accept their audit firm only." The printer coughed 2 pages. Ethan Cole said, "This is a leash disguised as order." The narrator felt time shrink by inches. Nina Park said, "We can write a carve-out tied to fraud risk." The plan felt small but sharp. The narrator held that point like a pin against a storm. The narrator traced headers across an email chain that smelled of smoke. Nina Park said, "This forward hops through the bank at 3:12. The cursor hovered on a name that hurt to see. Ethan Cole said, "We do not accuse until we lock the path." The log showed a copy to a private inbox. The narrator counted 3 domains and 1 late-night IP. Nina Park said, "It aligns with the time our deck leaked." A silence followed like a held breath. Ethan Cole said, "We mirror the inbox and preserve chain of custody." The steps felt careful, not slow. The narrator heard fans spin as exports wrote to a drive. Nina Park said, "The sender used a rule to hide the trace." The trap felt close. The narrator wrote the word breach and underlined it once. The narrator watched bids arrive like staged applause. Numbers looked neat, then too neat. Luis Ramirez said, "3 firms cite the same diligence note word for word." Ethan Cole read each line as if it could bite. Ethan Cole said, "These are anchors set to drag our price down." The spreadsheet showed timing within 1 minute. The narrator felt the pattern more than saw it. Luis Ramirez said, "A whisper network is steering the room." The phones rang with polite voices and soft traps. Ethan Cole said, "Ask for proof of funds and real timelines." The tone shifted on the second call. The narrator heard paper lift and then stall. Luis Ramirez said, "2 pulled back when I asked." The wind outside rose. The narrator marked the bids as smoke. The narrator stood with Ethan Cole in a quiet apartment that held old plans. A folder on a shelf carried the last safety net. Ethan Cole said, "The house is already pledged to the line." The words fell flat. The narrator felt a private weight settle in the room. Luis Ramirez said, "We can call the landlord and stagger rent." Pride pressed like a hand on glass. Ethan Cole said, "We pay our people first." The calendar showed a red block that would not move. The narrator heard the fridge buzz like a low alarm. Luis Ramirez said, "If this breaks, we rebuild clean." The vow sounded simple and hard. Ethan Cole said, "We finish the proof and change the terms." The narrator watched him close the folder and not look back. The narrator felt the company breathe like a tired runner. Choices narrowed to 2 thin roads. Ethan Cole said, "We reject the clause and risk default, or we accept and lose the wheel." The conference room held a long silence. Nina Park said, "The meter proof is strong enough to force a carve-out." The phones were quiet for once. Luis Ramirez said, "Payroll holds 1 day if we push vendors tonight." The narrator weighed the mix of risk and duty. Ethan Cole said, "We choose proof and control." The plan clicked into place with careful steps. The narrator noted the email subject that would start the fight. Nina Park said, "I will send the report at dawn." The room exhaled as if a storm had finally chosen its path. The narrator followed Nina Park down a service stair that smelled of dust and bleach. A door clicked, and a small room opened with old binders on metal racks. Nina Park said, "Maintenance logs keep better time than finance." A man in coveralls set a ledger on the table with care. Ethan Cole said, "We only need what is true." The pages showed power readings and shift notes in clean block letters. Nina Park said, "These numbers track the nights they claimed peak output." The lines did not match the claims. The narrator heard rain drum on a vent and felt a hush. Ethan Cole said, "If this holds, the story breaks." A key scraped as a cabinet opened to more boxes. Nina Park said, "We scan, then seal chain of custody." The narrator marked the hour as if it were a fuse lit at both ends. The narrator watched Nina Park stack the logs against shipment data with neat care. Columns lined up like tracks on a map. Nina Park said, "When output jumps, power should surge." The curve stayed flat on peak weeks. Ethan Cole said, "So the plant made smoke, not steel." The printer hissed a slow sheet that smelled like warm paper. Nina Park said, "This is independent of their books and their audit." The room felt colder than the rain. Ethan Cole said, "We show this first and say nothing more." The narrator heard the server fans pulse like a steady drum. Nina Park said, "Screenshots, scans, and witnesses will hold." The file names were clean and dated. The narrator wrote that proof had a shape, And it was simple. The narrator followed a footnote into a quiet archive on the target site. A dusty box held license files that no one claimed. Ethan Cole said, "This is a patent for a heat reclaim valve." The words felt dry and bright at once. Nina Park said, "It expired in filings, but the option to renew remains." A diagram showed a loop that saved power by design. Ethan Cole said, "If this works, the plant can be worth more fixed than sold." The narrator watched a smile try to form, and then wait. Nina Park said, "We price the license and the savings, then anchor terms." The rain slowed outside like a breath. Ethan Cole said, "We bet on repairs and clawbacks, not on lies." The narrator wrote that hope returned as math, not magic. The narrator stared at an access log that felt like a mirror. A mail rule moved copies to a private folder at night. Nina Park said, "The forward came from a device that matches a known pattern." A name rose like a bruise. Ethan Cole said, "We confirm before we confront." The trace crossed an old account tied to a mentor. The room held more quiet than air. Nina Park said, "The IP and the time fit Mark Ritter on 2 dates." The narrator felt a floorboard creak in memory. Ethan Cole said, "He sold my timing to the bidder who set the trap." A message draft opened and then closed. Ethan Cole said, "We face him with proof and hold the line." The narrator counted 3 heartbeats and wrote the 4th. The narrator entered a conference room where the rain finally eased. A call waited on the screen and terms waited on the table. Victoria Hale said, "Bring what you claim and price can bend." Ethan Cole set the logs and the license on the glass. Ethan Cole said, "We want clawbacks, clean audits, and joint control." The air felt thin but fair. Nina Park said, "Power data and license value support the ask." The silence that followed had weight, not threat. Victoria Hale said, "With proof, the wheel can share hands." The narrator felt a door unlock without sound. Ethan Cole said, "Then we write it, and we file it." The room breathed once, then twice. The narrator marked the hour. Hope changed shape. The narrator felt the room heat as screens woke to blue. Ethan Cole set the logs and license in neat rows. Ethan Cole said, "These readings kill the fantasy." The silence held like glass. Victoria Hale said, "If this is solid, price and power can share a road." The narrator watched Nina Park align pages with calm hands. Nina Park said, "Power stays flat on peak weeks, and the license adds value." The hum of air vents sounded like a low drum. Ethan Cole said, "We want clawbacks tied to fraud and clean audits." A cloud dimmed the skyline. Victoria Hale said, "You ask for teeth, not ribbon." The narrator wrote that the words were heavy but fair. Ethan Cole said, "We sign only if the wheel is shared." The clock moved, slow and loud. The narrator watched terms flow like sparks. Ethan Cole said, "Earnout tied to real output, clawbacks if claims fail." Paper slid across glass. Victoria Hale said, "Anti-dilution stays, but I relax the sweeps." The narrator marked each change as if it were a step on thin ice. Nina Park said, "Independent audit before close and after 6 months." A printer clicked like a metronome. Ethan Cole said, "Board seats split, vetoes narrow, budget reviewed in the open." The air felt cleaner. Victoria Hale said, "I trade veto for disclosure and margin targets." The narrator heard pens lift and hover. Ethan Cole said, "Then we have a path that can carry weight." The room eased but did not rest. The narrator followed Ethan Cole into a quiet lounge that smelled of rain and wood. Mark Ritter sat with a look that carried years. Mark Ritter said, "I sent timings to buy myself a future." The words fell hard. Ethan Cole said, "You sold trust for a short rope." A light flickered above them. Mark Ritter said, "I thought I could steer it back." The room did not agree. Ethan Cole said, "You will disclose and step down." The narrator counted a long breath. Mark Ritter said, "I will give a statement and return what I can." The weight shifted a little. Ethan Cole said, "You also face the board with me." The narrator wrote the hour, because it felt like a door that closed and a window that opened. The narrator returned to the war room where proof sat like steel. Nina Park said, "Draft to the regulator is ready." Keys clicked in clean rhythm. Ethan Cole said, "We file if talks fail or if the board stalls." The printer warmed the air. Luis Ramirez said, "Vendors hold one more day if we give updates." The team moved with quiet purpose. Nina Park said, "Exhibits are numbered and stamped." The narrator liked the order. Ethan Cole said, "We protect staff and cash first." A courier tag printed and curled. Luis Ramirez said, "Security is tight and keys rotated." The narrator felt the room steady. Ethan Cole said, "We are ready for either road." The clock stopped feeling like a threat. The narrator felt the day narrow to a single edge. A call waited with terms that still bit. Victoria Hale said, "Take the sweep or take the risk." The words were clean. Ethan Cole said, "We walk from the sweep and price the patent and repair." Silence held like a wire. Nina Park said, "Savings case supports the higher value." The numbers did not shake. Ethan Cole said, "Then we pass on cheap rescue and own the rebuild." The narrator watched a choice become a stand. Victoria Hale said, "Bring it to the board now." The room held its breath while the send key hovered. Ethan Cole said, "We choose the hard road that pays truth." The narrator wrote that the gamble felt like a plan, not a prayer. The narrator felt the morning arrive like a test that would not wait. Desks were neat, but hands were tight. Luis Ramirez said, "Payroll hits at noon, and vendors expect calls." The room listened to the clock. Ethan Cole said, "We cover people first, even if we bleed." The printer warmed and clicked like a slow drum. Nina Park said, "The packet is clean," and the scans matched the logs. The hallway fell quiet after a courier left. Ethan Cole said, "Hold nerves and keep phones warm." Hope did not show, but duty did. Luis Ramirez said, "If funds post, morale lifts on site." The narrator wrote that courage can look like paying on time. The narrator watched a new call open like a door with colder air. Victoria Hale said, "Price bends if you accept veto on spend." The words were calm and sharp. Ethan Cole said, "We share control or we pass." A pause held weight. A pause held weight. Nina Park said, "The savings model stands with outside data." The screen reflected rain that had not fallen yet. Victoria Hale said, "Then I trade rate for speed and a narrow veto." Silence tested the table. Ethan Cole said, "No veto on people or audit." The stare held and the clock clicked once. The narrator felt a gust move the shade, like weather in a room. The narrator stood with the team at a line that split easy from right. Ethan Cole said, "No veto on people, and no sweeps that choke cash." The table did not move. Victoria Hale said, "Control protects capital when storms turn." The room held breath. Nina Park said, "Transparency gives control its shape, not fear." The echo was small and clear. Ethan Cole said, "We accept targets, reports, and a budget we vote." A lift moved in the shaft like a slow bell. Victoria Hale said, "Then bring your board, and I bring mine." The narrator marked the turn because it felt earned. The air tasted like rain before it starts. The narrator felt the hour bend as choices narrowed to proof and light. Nina Park said, "Limited disclosure is ready if the board stalls." The words were steady. Ethan Cole said, We send only enough to force clean terms. The cursor waited like a held breath. Luis Ramirez said, "Staff knows we guard cash and truth." The hallway sounded kinder. Ethan Cole said, "File the notice if they delay." The send key glowed and dimmed. Nina Park said, "Draft queued with custody notes and scans." The clock rolled to the minute. The narrator wrote that pressure, when honest, can clear a sky. The narrator entered the boardroom where the storm finally broke. A vote card sat at each seat like a small verdict. Ethan Cole said, "We take the build, the clawbacks, and shared wheel." Eyes met and then dropped. A director cleared a throat and nodded once. Nina Park said, "Power logs and license value anchor the price." The long table felt shorter. Victoria Hale said, "Sign on joint control, or I walk to the next room." The pause held like glass. Ethan Cole said, "Then sign, and we build what the numbers promise." Pens moved. The narrator wrote that the deal changed shape and kept its spine. The narrator felt the office breathe for the first time in days. Monitors showed steady numbers and calm lines. Luis Ramirez said, "Wires cleared, and vendors thanked us." Relief moved like warm air. Ethan Cole said, "People first was the right call." The phones rang, but the tone had changed. Nina Park said, "Audit dates are locked, and the license filing posted." The room answered with quiet work. Victoria Hale said, "Joint control stands. We keep the plan clean." The narrator wrote that duty once paid becomes trust. Ethan Cole said, "We build on proof and keep the wheel shared." The day did not shout. It held. The narrator entered a small boardroom where the past waited in a chair. Mark Ritter set a signed letter on the table. Mark Ritter said, "I step down and disclose to the regulators." The words landed without drama, which felt right. Ethan Cole said, "You will also return fees, and you will face questions." The blinds clicked in a slow rhythm. Mark Ritter said, "I will answer and accept the cost." No one raised a voice. The narrator wrote that endings can be honest and still hurt. Ethan Cole said, "History will be the record we keep." The room emptied, and so did a weight. The narrator walked the floor with the team and heard light talk return. Luis Ramirez gathered leads and juniors by the whiteboard. Luis Ramirez said, "We pay on time, we tell the truth, and we fix fast." Heads nodded. Ethan Cole said, "You kept us upright when it mattered." The smile in the room felt earned. Nina Park said, "Data saved us, but courage carried it." A chuckle ran soft and brief. The narrator wrote that fear fades when work begins. Luis Ramirez said, "If we stumble again, we stumble forward." The room clapped once, and once was enough. The narrator watched the city wake as light climbed the towers. Ethan Cole stood alone with a quiet screen and a warm cup. Ethan Cole said, "Noise can look like truth until you measure it." The line felt simple and right. The skyline did not judge. Nina Park said, "We will keep the measures close and the claims small." The words settled like clean tools in a drawer. The narrator wrote that calm has a sound when fear leaves. Ethan Cole said, "We build slow and count fast." The cup steamed and the morning held. The narrator stood at the window as the day settled into clear lines. A deal sat signed, but not soft. Victoria Hale said, "We share the wheel, and we watch the road." The tone held respect, not heat. Ethan Cole said, "Winning is refusing the deal that wins you nothing." The words were plain, and they fit. Nina Park said, "We keep the proof close and the lights honest." The narrator wrote the last line because it felt earned. Luis Ramirez said, "Then we go back to work." The city answered with quiet motion. The story did not end. It held its shape.